Mark and Julia Bennett appeared to have the perfect life, until their newborn baby's rare disability shattered their world. But what happened next wasn't just heartbreak. It was a nightmare no one saw coming. Julia vanished without a trace, and the chilling truth buried beneath their quiet suburban lawn would shock an entire town and reveal a secret so dark it almost didn't survive. In the quiet suburb of Willow Creek, the streets were lined with trimmed hedges and white fences. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved from their driveways and Sunday barbecues brought entire blocks together. Among the families that called it home, Mark and Julia Bennett stood out, not because they were loud or flashy, but because they seemed so effortlessly perfect. Mark, a tall, clean-cut architect with a steady career, was known for his charm and generosity. Julia, with her warm smile and soft-spoken nature, worked as a kindergarten teacher and was adored by children and parents alike. Together, they looked like the embodiment of suburban success, young, attractive, and deeply in love. They had met in college, married soon after graduation, and quickly became the kind of couple people looked up to. Their house, a pale blue two-story with a wraparound porch, was featured in a local magazine for its elegant design. They hosted wine nights, gave to local charities, and were often seen walking their golden retriever, Max, through the neighborhood park. When Julia announced she was pregnant, the news was met with celebration. Neighbors brought over handmade blankets and baby gifts. Mark planted a new tree in their front yard, saying it would grow with their child. From the outside, it was a picture of domestic bliss. But perfection has a way of hiding things. Behind their carefully maintained facade, cracks were forming. Julia's pregnancy wasn't as easy as it seemed. She often complained of feeling drained, and Mark, though attentive in public, had begun pulling away at home. Friends noticed subtle changes. Julia canceling meetups, Mark working late more often, unexplained tension in their voices. Still, no one questioned it. Every couple had their moments, people reasoned. Besides, the Bennetts always bounced back. As the due date approached, Julia became more reserved. She stopped sharing updates on social media, kept to herself, and focused entirely on preparing the nursery. Meanwhile, Mark immersed himself in his work, accepting more projects than usual. When asked if he was excited to be a dad, he would smile, but his eyes gave nothing away. There was a silence growing between them, one neither acknowledged but both felt. The cracks were no longer invisible, they were just ignored. To the world, the Bennetts remained perfect. But inside that beautiful blue house, something dark was quietly brewing. No one could have imagined that the arrival of their baby would mark not a new beginning, but the beginning of the end. Julia went into labor on a cold March evening, earlier than expected. The hospital room was sterile and tense, the air thick with anxiety rather than joy. Mark sat rigidly in the corner, barely speaking, while Julia gripped the sides of the bed through contractions. The delivery was complicated and exhausting. When baby Henry finally arrived, the room went quiet. No cries filled the air. Doctors and nurses exchanged looks before quickly moving into action. Something was wrong. Within hours, specialists delivered the news Julia had feared deep in her gut for months. Henry was born with a rare neurological disorder, one that would leave him with limited motor function and severe developmental delays. He would likely never walk, never talk, and would require full-time care for the rest of his life. Julia held her baby with trembling arms, tears running down her face, but her love was immediate. She kissed his forehead, whispered to him, and told him he was perfect. Mark, on the other hand, barely looked at his son. Released from the start, Mark seemed disconnected. He stayed in the hospital only as long as required, then disappeared under the excuse of catching up on work. When he did visit, he stood at a distance, arms folded, as if the baby was a stranger. Julia noticed but said nothing. She was too busy learning how to feed Henry through a tube, how to bathe him carefully, how to understand his subtle expressions. She slept in a chair by his crib, determined to be strong, but her body and mind were breaking. When they finally brought Henry home, their once charming house felt colder. The nursery, painted in soft blues and grays, felt too quiet. Mark avoided it. He rarely held his son, never changed a diaper, and seemed to flinch at the sound of Henry's faint cries. Julia tried to talk to him, to share her fears and hopes, but Mark would only nod or leave the room. She began writing in a journal at night, pouring her thoughts into its pages when Mark was asleep. She felt alone but still held on to hope. Mark's resentment grew. He stopped pretending. He referred to Henry as "it" when he spoke at all. Julia could feel the walls closing in, but couldn't bring herself to believe he might truly hate their child. Or worse, blame her. 2 weeks after Henry's homecoming, Julia disappeared. No goodbye, no warning, just gone. Mark called 911 that morning, reporting that his wife had left sometime during the night. He sounded calm, maybe too calm, as he told the dispatcher she had been under stress, struggling to cope with their baby's condition. He claimed she had likely walked out to clear her head and never came back. When police arrived, Mark handed over a typed note he said he'd found on their kitchen table. It read, "I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry." The officers took the note, nodded solemnly, and opened a missing persons case. Friends and neighbors were shocked. Julia had shown no signs of being unstable. In fact, many remembered her speaking about Henry with pride and fierce protectiveness, but the police had little to work with. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, and a note that, on the surface, looked like a farewell. When they questioned Mark, he maintained his story. Julia had been overwhelmed, sleep-deprived, and emotionally drained. He repeated the same phrases, almost rehearsed. She wasn't herself. She loved Henry, but she wasn't strong enough. The officers believed him, or at least they didn't see any reason not to. A small search was organized. Flyers went up around Willow Creek. Volunteers combed nearby parks, trails, and wooded areas. But no clues surfaced. No one had seen Julia leave the house. No cameras had captured her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. As the days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. The case cooled. People whispered but stopped asking questions. Mark remained in the house, continuing life as though nothing had happened. He hired a part-time nurse to help with Henry and told others he was focusing on moving forward. Strangely, Mark never shed a tear publicly. He didn't attend any of the vigils organized in Julia's honor. He gave no press interviews. When Julia's sister tried to speak with him, he declined and blocked her number. Some found his behavior suspicious, but there was nothing concrete to act on. The typed note remained the only piece of physical evidence, and with no body, no witnesses, and no motive anyone could prove, Julia was simply labeled missing. People moved on, but inside the Bennett house the truth wasn't buried deep. It was just hidden, waiting for someone to find it. 6 months after Julia vanished, the house next door to the Bennetts was bought by the Carsons, a quiet family looking for a fresh start. Among them was their 17-year-old daughter Emily, a thoughtful and observant girl who preferred books and nature over social media and party. She quickly noticed the stark difference between her cheerful new neighborhood and the house directly beside hers. The Bennett home seemed frozen in time. The blinds stayed drawn, the grass was often uncut, and the man who lived there, Mark, rarely smiled or spoke to anyone. Emily spent much of her time outside, tending to a small garden her mother helped her build. She liked the quiet and found peace in planting herbs and flowers. From her garden, she could see into the Bennett's backyard. One day, while watering her lavender, she noticed something strange. A rectangular patch of dirt beneath the rose bushes that didn't match the rest of the yard. The soil there looked newer, looser, as if it had been recently dug up and refilled. The roses above it seemed to have been planted in a rush, their spacing uneven. At first, Emily brushed it off. Maybe it was just a gardening project. But over the next few weeks, she began to notice more odd details. Mark was often in the backyard late at night, sometimes standing silently by the rose bushes, sometimes unlocking the small shed and going inside for hours. She never saw him with gardening tools or even a watering can. The shed, too, was odd. It had thick locks and dark curtains covering the inside windows. Most people use theirs for lawnmowers and bikes. This one looked more like a sealed vault. The more Emily watched, the more unsettled she became. She started keeping a notebook, writing down the time she saw Mark outside, what he was doing, and any strange sounds. One night, she thought she heard digging, sharp, rhythmic noises coming from behind the fence. Another night, she saw him pacing, talking to himself. She told her mother, who listened politely but dismissed it as imagination. After all, what teenager didn't let curiosity run wild now and then? Still, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something hidden, something the roses were meant to cover. And while she didn't know what it was, she knew she was getting closer to the truth with every quiet observation. On a stormy afternoon in early October, something unexpected happened inside the Bennett house. The part-time nurse Sarah had arrived as usual to care for Henry. With thunder rumbling outside, she began cleaning the nursery, trying to organize the clutter that had built up over the past few months. While moving the crib to vacuum underneath it, she accidentally bumped into a vent cover on the wall. It came loose and clattered to the floor. Behind it, buried in dust, was a leather-bound journal. Curious and concerned, Sarah pulled it out and wiped it clean. The journal belonged to Julia. Her name was written on the inside cover in neat, familiar handwriting. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then began to read. The entries started months before Julia disappeared, and each page revealed a deeper descent into fear and desperation. Julia wrote about Mark's growing detachment, his refusal to accept Henry's condition, and the coldness that crept into their marriage. She documented everything: his cutting remarks, his long absences, the way he flinched when touching the baby, and how he blamed her for what had happened. As Sarah flipped through the pages, the entries became darker. Julia wrote about feeling unsafe, about locking her bedroom door at night, about catching Mark staring at her in silence for long stretches. One entry detailed a moment when she found him standing over Henry's crib in the dark, not moving. She wrote about hiding the journal in the nursery wall in case anything ever happened to her. The final entry was only half a page long. It ended with the words, "He knows I'm planning to leave. If anything happens to me." Sarah's hands trembled as she closed the journal. She didn't know what to do at first, but by that evening she had made up her mind. She turned the journal over to the police. It changed everything. For the first time, there was something tangible, something real, to suggest Julia hadn't left willingly. Investigators reopened the case immediately. They questioned Sarah thoroughly, then secured a warrant to search the Bennett property. The journal, once hidden in a nursery wall, had become the voice Julia never got to use, and with it, the truth that had been buried, literally and figuratively, was finally starting to rise to the surface. The investigation was no longer about a missing woman. It was about a possible murder. The search team arrived at the Bennett property just before sunrise. Armed with a warrant and led by forensic specialists, they moved with quiet precision. Yellow tape went up around the perimeter, and Mark was escorted out of the house without incident. He didn't ask questions, didn't protest. He only watched as officers and technicians stepped into his backyard and began their work. The focus was immediate and specific: the rose bushes. The soil beneath them was softer than expected, and it took only minutes for the team to uncover the first signs of something unnatural. Beneath the top layer of mulch and roots, wrapped in deteriorated fabric, they found a human body. It was curled in on itself, limbs drawn up tightly, as if the person had been confined in a small space. The remains were quickly confirmed to be Julia Bennett, Newark. The discovery spread quickly, and the entire town of Willow Creek was stunned. Julia hadn't run away. She had been home all along, just feet from where her baby slept each night. But what made the discovery even more horrific was what came next. The medical examiner's report revealed something no one was prepared for. There was soil in Julia's lungs. She hadn't been dead when she was buried. She had been alive, breathing, when the dirt covered her. The implications were terrifying. Julia had been conscious, at least for a time, beneath the ground. Her final moments had been spent suffocating in the darkness, alone and terrified. The idea was too awful to comprehend. Investigators pieced together the timeline. Based on the state of the body and the last journal entry, it was clear Julia had been murdered the very night she disappeared. Mark had sedated her. Traces of sleeping medication were found in her system, but not enough to kill her. He had taken her to the backyard and buried her, assuming she would never wake up. But she had forensic teams also found the shovel used in the shed still covered in soil that matched the burial site. Small traces of Julia's blood were found on the handle. There was no longer any doubt. This wasn't a disappearance. It was premeditated murder. With the truth unearthed, Mark was charged and taken into custody. What had once been the town's model family was now at the center of one of the most disturbing crimes Willow Creek had ever seen. And it wasn't over yet. There were still more questions, more horrors to come. After Julia's body was discovered and Mark was arrested, investigators turned their attention to the house and everything in it. They cataloged every object, every scrap of paper, every item that could serve as evidence. One piece in particular stood out: a small plastic shovel found in Henry's crib. At first it seemed like just another toy, bright yellow, lightweight, something a toddler might take to the sandbox. But when a forensic technician picked it up, they noticed faint smudges on the handle that didn't match typical wear. Tests were run. The results were chilling. Traces of Julia's blood were found in the shallow crevices near the grip, along with soil that matched the backyard. The plastic shovel, it turned out, wasn't just a toy. It was the same tool Mark had used to dig Julia's grave. Somehow, after the murder, he had cleaned it up just enough to pass it off as harmless and placed it in Henry's crib, among his blankets and stuffed animals. To anyone else, it looked like a child's toy, but to Mark it was a symbol. Perhaps of control, perhaps of cruelty. Sarah, the nurse, broke down when she heard. She remembered trying to remove the shovel multiple times. Each time she did, Henry would scream and cry inconsolably. At first she thought it was just a comfort object. Now she wondered if the baby had somehow associated it with fear. Though Henry couldn't speak, couldn't walk, and had limited ways to express himself, he had reacted every single time to that one item. Investigators noted that behavior in their report. It wasn't evidence in the traditional sense, but it spoke volumes. The twisted psychology behind the gesture stunned everyone involved. It was as if Mark had left a trophy in plain sight, daring fate to expose him. He had placed a weapon of murder into the hands of a baby too young to understand it, too helpless to resist. It raised new questions about Mark's mindset. Was it guilt that made him do it? Arrogance? Or something darker? An intentional act meant to torment? Henry's cries, once seen as random outbursts, now took on a haunting new meaning. The plastic shovel was removed from the house and bagged as evidence. For the first time, even the most skeptical officers began to view Henry not just as a surviving child, but as a silent witness to something unimaginable. When Mark was finally brought in for questioning, the calm facade he had maintained for months began to crack. At first he sat silently, hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed on the floor. But as the detectives laid out the evidence, the journal, the forensic reports, and the plastic shovel, the tension in the room thickened. The cold, controlled man many had seen was now visibly shaken, though not with remorse. Instead, anger simmered beneath the surface. Mark began blaming Julia for everything that had gone wrong. He spoke bitterly of how the pregnancy had ruined his life, how the baby's disability was a burden he hadn't signed up for. His words were harsh and unfiltered, revealing a dark side no one had seen before. He claimed he never wanted to hurt Julia, but said she pushed him too far, suggesting her refusal to leave had led to a tragic accident. The carefully constructed story fell apart under questioning, as contradictions and lies piled up. Despite the mounting evidence, Mark refused to admit guilt. He described Julia's condition after the birth as unnatural, blaming her emotional state for their problem. When pressed about burying her alive, he denied it outright, insisting she was already unconscious when placed in the ground. But forensic experts and the journal told a different story. The soil in her lungs proved otherwise, and Julia's final entries painted a picture of fear and desperation, of a woman trying to escape a nightmare. During the hours of interrogation, Mark's demeanor shifted erratically, from cold detachment to bursts of rage. He confessed to sedating Julia, hoping to calm her, but claimed he had no plan beyond that. His story twisted into something darker when he admitted to burying her in the backyard, convinced she would never wake up. The realization that she had lived long enough to suffer beneath the earth seemed to ignite something inside him. He showed no remorse for the pain he caused, only frustration that his plan had failed. Investigators uncovered more disturbing details as they searched the Bennett home. Mark had installed soundproof panels in the backyard shed, which he used for late-night digging and to muffle any noise. The house, once a symbol of suburban bliss, was revealed to be a prison of secrets and cruelty. Friends and neighbors struggled to reconcile the image of the man they thought they knew with the one the evidence painted. A man capable of calculated, cruel violence. In the end, Mark's coldness and anger only sealed his fate. His denial couldn't erase the truth, and the dark cracks beneath the perfect life he tried to maintain were now fully exposed. The town of Willow Creek would never forget what had happened behind that blue house, or the man who had hidden a terrible secret beneath the roses. As the trial began, the quiet town of Willow Creek was gripped by a mix of horror, disbelief, and morbid curiosity. News crews flocked to the courthouse, neighbors whispered in stunned groups, and the community tried to come to terms with the terrible truth. The Bennett case wasn't just a crime story. It was a brutal reminder that darkness could lurk behind even the most perfect facades. The prosecution presented a detailed and haunting picture. They laid out the evidence meticulously. Julia's journal revealing her growing fear, the forensic proof that she had been buried alive, and the chilling discovery of the plastic shovel in Henry's crib. Experts testified about the baby's condition and the psychological toll it had taken on the family. The story they told was of a man overwhelmed by fear and hatred, who chose to silence his wife rather than seek help or support. Mark's defense tried to paint him as a broken husband and father, a man crushed by the weight of an unexpected, difficult situation. They argued he never intended to kill Julia, that her death was a tragic accident born from panic and poor decisions. But the jury was not swayed. The cold facts and Julia's heartbreaking words were too powerful to ignore. Throughout the trial, Henry remained in the care of social services, watched over by nurses and specialists who dedicated themselves to his well-being. Though he was a baby who could not speak or walk, his presence in the courtroom was a silent testament to what had been lost and what had survived. Witnesses described moments when Henry would cry out unexpectedly, sometimes when the plastic shovel was mentioned, a reminder of the trauma he had endured even before he could understand the world around him. As testimony unfolded, more disturbing details came to light. Mark's meticulous efforts to hide the crime, his lack of empathy, and his cold, calculated actions painted a portrait of a man who had crossed a line from despair into darkness. His refusal to accept responsibility only deepened the jury's conviction. In the end, after hours of deliberation, the verdict was unanimous. Mark Bennett was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. For Willow Creek, the verdict brought a grim sense of closure, but also a lingering sorrow. A young woman's life had been cut short, a baby's innocence forever marked, and a community's trust forever broken. The story of the Bennetts was a tragic warning, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying secrets hide behind the calmest faces. Months after the trial, as Mark Bennett sat behind bars, the small town of Willow Creek tried to heal, but the scars ran deep. Julia's absence was felt in every quiet corner, the empty blue house, the silent nursery, and the whispered memories of a woman who had loved fiercely but was silenced in the worst way imaginable. The community struggled to reconcile the image of the perfect family with the horror that had unfolded. The story of Julia's murder had become a cautionary tale, shared in hushed conversations and in the news, a dark shadow over what once felt safe. Yet amid the tragedy, something remarkable emerged. An unexpected survivor who changed everything. Henry Bennett, the baby who had been at the center of the nightmare, was still alive. Though born with a severe disability, Henry showed resilience that confounded doctors and specialists. He grew slowly but steadily, his small hands grasping, his eyes bright with curiosity. Caregivers and therapists dedicated themselves to giving him the best life possible, nurturing the flicker of hope that had survived despite the darkness. What no one expected was how Henry became the key to unlocking more of the story. As he grew, therapists noticed he responded differently to voices, to touch, and to the presence of certain objects. One day, while playing quietly, Henry reached for a photo of Julia, his mother, and smiled, a rare and precious moment. It was as if, despite everything, some connection had remained unbroken. The person who truly solved the case, however, was not a detective or a lawyer, but this fragile child. Silent in many ways, but a living testament to what had happened. His survival forced the town, the justice system, and even Mark's defense team to confront a painful truth, that even in the darkest moments, life finds a way to endure. Julia's journal was published posthumously, shared with the world as a voice for those who cannot speak. Her words sparked conversations about the hidden struggles of families with disabled children, about the need for compassion, support, and understanding. The town established a memorial garden in her honor, a place where people could reflect on resilience and love amid loss. In the end, the Bennett's story was more than a crime. It was a testament to the human spirit's capacity to survive, to heal, and to shine light on the shadows. Henry's quiet presence remained a symbol, not just of tragedy, but of hope, a reminder that even when buried beneath despair, life can still grow toward the light.